Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, if you ever can't hear me, just yell and I'll speak louder or move this in front of my face. So, first, a little bit about me. I was the director of engineering at OFA, which was the Obama for America campaign. I am clearly your typical political operative. I look just like everybody in politics.
Did Harper make you have a beard?
No, I made Harper have a beard. So today what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of context about what the campaign was and what we did, how we monitored and kind of what we monitored, and a couple of things that I wish we had done. So a little bit more about me. I started out at Crate and Barrel, which again is the typical path for politics. Start out selling software, building software for housewares. From there I went on to build software for t-shirts. And then clearly the next step is try to re-elect the president. And what I did there was to try to rebuild their infrastructure. So tried to go from something that looked like this, which was kind of a crazy thing, to something that looked a little bit more like this, which was a little bit cleaner, made a little bit more sense, and hopefully could be reused instead of trashed afterwards. So we had to do this while it was in heavy use. And so, like, people have talked about it sort of like rebuilding a plane while it's taking off, and that felt like that a lot. So to do that, we had 18 months. I started in April 2011. We worked 7 days a week, about 18 hours a day on average, which is crazy. Don't do that. We had, in my teams, we had about 40 engineers split out among 7 different teams working on different products. We had about 300 repos, and in that there were about 200 deployed products. We had about 3,000. This was all on AWS, so that went up and down a lot, but it was somewhere around 3,000. A couple million views a day. We built software to help over 1 million volunteers do stuff for us, and over 8,000 staff. But really there was only one metric that actually mattered, which was 270. Now for those of you who don't know how American elections work, we have this hilarious abstraction layer over direct democracy, which is the Electoral College, and you need 270 electoral votes to actually win. So that's what that is. So that's what it's all about. Let me give you guys sort of a quick rundown of how campaigns actually work, because when I started, I didn't know at all. I knew nothing about campaigns. I was kind of an idiot. Another pro tip, learn about what it is that you're going to do before you do it. It helps a lot. So a campaign is essentially 4 different phases. And the way that ours was broken up was like 6 months to plan, 6 months to build, 6 months to execute, and then GOTV is that last weekend. And I'll explain what these are a little bit more, both for the campaign in general and for the technology group in specific. So the first is plan. And this is where everybody comes up with their dreams of everything that could happen during this entire time. It's great. Everybody's happy, everybody's looking towards the future. We're not moving super fast, and that still means like 6 days a week and 12 hours a day. But it's relatively speaking, it's nice and calm. For tech, we need to start building. So if we wait until people know what they want 6 months down the line to actually start building things, we're never going to be able to catch up. So we have to go with sort of a best guess of what it is. There's some basic building blocks that we'll be able to use that we can start building at that point. Next phase, which is about 6 months later, is build. So for the rest of the campaign, that means building up the staff, building up the teams, and that is when we went from 200 staff to a couple thousand, really building out the volunteer base, and that's sending out emails, getting people involved, and raising money. Americans, you may have gotten some emails about that. And then also building out the technology. This is when the campaign thinks that technology starts happening, but in reality we've been doing it for 6 months, and this is sort of when we take the things that we made our best guess and start trying to shove them into the things that they decided they actually want. So for tech, this means keep building and make money. The last phase is the penultimate phase is actually the last 6 months, which is execution. This is when all of the things actually happen. You go out and you talk to voters, you get them excited, you get volunteers happening, like you really build up the organization. This is when people actually start to become excited about the election. This is when it all really happens. And for tech, this means keep building. But this is actually the first time that we have real user feedback, which I don't recommend building something for a year before you get user feedback, but that's how we had to do it. And then there's GeoTV. This is not a TV station. It took me like 3 weeks to figure that out. That means get out the vote. And that is the last 4 days, so Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, which is election day. Really weird, hilarious thing about American politics is that if you actually don't go and knock on people's doors and get them to commit to go vote, a lot of them don't. They just forget. They don't care that much. So actually getting out and knocking on the doors that last weekend and calling people up on the phone makes a huge difference on whether things work or not. So this is really what makes or breaks an entire election. So for tech, what this means is scale. And not just like a little bit of scale, but like a lot of scale. Like, you know, we had this whole thing happening and we've been building this entire time, and then all of a sudden it changes and you have real scale immediately. So you have graphs that look like this, where this is our call tool, where for 6 months we'd been using it every day. We'd been making somewhere around 1,000 calls a day, which is great. And we'd been spending the entire time talking to the engineer saying, we really need to rebuild this entire thing for scale. And this was like 3 months out, and he's looking at me like, dude, there's 1,000 calls a day. It's not that big of a deal. And I'm like, no, we need to just tear it all down. Let's redo the whole thing. And so we went through that a bunch of times, and he kept looking at me like I was crazy because we'd do that and then it'd be like 1,200 calls. And he's like, awesome, dude. And then we were pretty much there until about a week before the election. And then Saturday, we did 250,000 calls. And then Sunday, we did 400,000 calls. Monday, we did 750,000 calls. And then on election day, we did 1.2 million calls, which that's a pretty drastic change in the amount of scale in 4 days. And there's no time to change anything during that. So at that point, I felt vindicated, which is good. But this is it's the same thing, but this is on a daily view. The other thing, we mentioned about how this is sort of the time when it all happens towards actually changing the outcome or securing the outcome of an election. So this is really the point where technology has an opportunity to make sure that things happen. So there's this whole narrative in the media about how technology won the election, which is complete bullshit. We did a great job, and I love my team, and we're all wonderful, but we didn't win anything. We could have lost the election, but we didn't win it. So, with all that as a backdrop, we have all these apps, we have all these people watching. What do? So, if we have what I'll call a hiccup in one of our apps where, something goes down for a couple hours, that has repercussions in the press, like New York Times writes a story. It could have very serious legal ramifications with campaign finance stuff. If some part of our financial application goes down, that could have huge repercussions. And it could actually change the way that the election runs. If the call tool had been down those last 3 days, that would have been 3 million people that we didn't get to talk to. It's kind of a huge deal. So we want to keep the hiccups to a minimum. So to do that, there are 2 ways that we did. We monitored more so that our hiccups were smaller, because they're still going to happen. Like, we're not perfect. We're writing software and we're building technology. It's never going to always work, so let's make sure that the times that it doesn't work are as small as possible. And the other thing is have less things to actually fail. So I want to talk about that one real quick, just real quick. So I have this idea about architectural simplicity, which is simply, if you want to make things that look like this is our actual infrastructure diagram of what we had at the end. which is a little bit more complicated than that drawing that I showed earlier. So if you make that out of a bunch of small pieces that are really easily understood, it's going to make things a lot easier. Essentially, complex systems are hard. If you make the small pieces of it easy, you can eliminate that. So make the easy things easy so you can focus on the hard problems. And then the other part, monitoring. So what and how? Monitor all the things. As many things as we can possibly think of to monitor, we did. We used some tools. I left a whole bunch of them off because we used as many things as we could think of. We were completely indiscriminate about what we used because some of those things worked absolutely wonderfully for one problem and didn't work very well for another problem. Some of them were great for certain times or certain scale and completely fell on their face at a different scale. So we had to use essentially as many different ways as we possibly could to be able to get that stuff. So the way that we sort of came to that is a friend of ours worked in fraud analysis for banks, so fraud detection and fraud analysis. And they had this great product that they built. They were this great startup, and they would often go and they'd get a deal with a bank, and they'd go to the bank's data center, and they'd be installing their stuff, and then the next rack over would be their main competitor installing their solution for the same bank. And they were like, what? Why? Like, the banks don't care. The banks are like, if you'll tell me that something's fraud and you'll tell me something's fraud, that's great. I want to know everything and I'll decide for myself. So get as much information as we possibly can and figure out things on top of that. So that was essentially what we did with monitoring. I have hilarious platitudes mixed in here. Monitoring is only worth it if people are actually monitoring. Shocking. So that brings us to alerts and dashboards. We largely failed at alerting. Alerting effectively is super hard. There are too many possibilities to tune to do it right in a small amount of time. So, for instance, my inbox was a terrible, terrible place during the campaign. This is 24 hours. So that's 1,800 non-filtered emails. Those are from like real people, like real emails that I have to deal with. And then the 2,500, those are Nagios alerts, and the 1138, that's New Relic alerts, and there's some custom alerts and more custom alerts. That's 8,000 alerts in 24 hours. It's meaningless. It's just screaming into the wind. So we found that alerting needed appropriate severity. So the way that we did that was poorly. Essentially, we sharded those alerts out to the teams that mattered in a small scale, and then they had less noise, but still too much noise. And then we had to bubble everything up through yelling. It worked really well. It's not something that scales very well, but when you have a team of 40 people, you can actually get by with yelling, particularly if you're there all the time. Phone calls. Phone calls actually work really well. Actually getting to actually talk to a person is great. Calls from PagerDuty were super nice. Calls from your boss at 2 in the morning, often less nice, but way more effective at actually getting things done. And then there was our secret sauce, which again, totally not scalable, but people. We had this hilarious situation on the campaign where we had more volunteers than we knew what to do with. So we could, there's this saying where you can replace somebody's job with a well-written bash script. We would replace well-written bash scripts with a bunch of interns. It worked really well. So no matter what your app is, you generally have power users. And they generally know when things are going poorly long before you do. If you're focusing on building software, making sure that all of your systems are up, one specific piece of software, the person that's actually using that and uses it all the time is always going to know before you do. So I want to talk about my friend Craig. When we were at Threadless, Craig was our power user. He actually also worked for us. But he would constantly find the things that were wrong before we did. So it's like CDN was out, we'd get an email from him being like, everything looks weird. We're like, okay, cool. Or, whatever it might be, the pictures were wrong, whatever happened, we always got an email from him first. So there are friendly people who are already monitoring your sites. Figure out a way to leverage them. They also find things that are oftentimes really hard to monitor, like poisoned caches. It looks right, like it's sending the right thing, but it's like showing the wrong picture. It's hard to automatically detect that, but a person is looking at that going, this is all wrong. The other fun thing is they already know how to make it your priority. So they circumvented that whole how do you alert thing, and they just talk to your boss. The downside is that they only monitor the downstream. So like they're going to look at a final rendered web page and say, well, this looks wrong. They're not going to be able to tell you anything specific. So you can take that, and then you need to figure out what it means upstream. So look at so this is when you have all of these monitors that you can go back to and you say, okay, well, this looks weird. It looks like this across all of my monitors. And start to figure out what that actually means, and you can start to recognize what problems are by what their side effects are. And it also leads to amazing things where you can create these custom dashboards for specific problem sets. Or, my favorite trick, build custom dashboards that are actually relevant to the power users and give it to them. So we had stuff for donations, where we had a custom dashboard for that, and we gave it to the person who was in charge of the business side of donations, and they would let us know when they thought something was wrong. It was like, donations aren't happening as fast as we think they should be. That's cool, that's helpful. So then we could go in and we could look at all of our donation level monitoring and say, oh, it looks like 50% of our users aren't actually seeing a button. That's kind of a problem. So those are a bunch of the things that we did. Now I want to talk about the things that I wish we had done. Number one, monitor people. Not that kind of monitoring people. So my team was super overworked. They were frustrated. They had a terrible, terrible time. I mean, it was wonderful, and they're the best team I've ever worked with, but it was the hardest job ever. I actually, on Monday, I had a friend of mine from the campaign was back in Chicago visiting, and I was like, what do you want to do for lunch? You're back in Chicago. What do you miss? And he was like, I didn't eat when I was on the campaign. That's so messed up. How do I monitor the health of my team the same way that I can monitor the health of my systems? I don't know what that looks like, but I have some ideas. So I'm super into Fitbit recently, really into it. I walk stupidly. But maybe that helps. Maybe putting an aggregate Fitbit dashboard for the whole team so you can see how often people are getting up and walking around, because then they're going to be more healthy and they're going to be better at doing the jobs and all of these great things. Maybe it's just a simple feedback input, either while the tests are running or while something's building. Just have something that looks like that. Maybe that's good. Maybe sentiment analysis of commit messages. I don't know. I leave that to you guys to figure out, but that would be awesome. I would use that in a heartbeat. The other thing that I wish that I could do is automate those power users. So I talked about how great they are and they're wonderful, but they're still people, and if I could replace them with computers, I would. So all they're doing is they're looking at a site and seeing things change. It's not the most complicated thing in the world, but it's really hard. So what are people that are smarter than me doing with that? Brett Slacken from Google is smarter than me. So at I/O this year and at Velocity, he gave this great talk about perceptual diffs for releases to do better testing on that, where it's essentially you take a snapshot before the release and a snapshot after, and you compare what they look like, and if it's wrong, then you stop the release. It sounds so simple when you say it, but it was mind-blowing. Why not PDIFs for monitoring? That would be great. anything with the CDN or anything with like, if one thing is really slow, if you're having a DNS problem, whatever it might be, that could show up in that, and that would be great. But I don't know. So essentially, these are the takeaways. They're all the most obvious thing in the world, which is really what this is all about, is like, monitor the things that matter however you can. Learn what the downstream looks like so that you can fix the upstream. Listen to the people because they're way more in touch than you are. And be careful about alerts, because when things actually need to be alerts, you need to be able to hear them. And on the dream side, why aren't we watching ourselves? I don't know what that looks like, but I hope someone here figures it out. And automate your power users, maybe using PDIFs, maybe there's other great ideas. Please make that happen. Thanks. I'm Dylan. I'll be around. I'd love to talk with anybody about anything. Thanks.